Okay, David Cross again, and our last video in this particular series is going to be a few of the appliance menu configuration items. Particularly of importance are things like SNMP, setting up syslog, and a couple areas that you're going to eventually be working in terms of setting up updates for the OS and or um, binaries that are configured on the system. So when you first log in as Appadmin is a menu-driven user. It does not have an open shell other than the system and will log you out. From a menu capacity, the first option is going to give us the configuration. And under the configuration, the key areas here are going to be the network. We'll go through some date and time, SNMP, and then we can take a look at some of the system configurations. So under network, once your system's fully configured, you'll be brought back into a menu to define its general setting of its fully qualified name, the DNS servers. You can enable, disable IPv6 from here, and then also your default gateway so that the network interfaces, the GLAN1 is effectively the default gateway, and anything else turns into a secondary and or route internally to that interface. Now, denial of service is something that is enabled. I won't go through all of the particular capabilities here, but there are different types that you can define, such as DNS, DHCP, ping floods, send floods, that you can then start rate limiting from a client capacity on this DNS server. So to prevent or mitigate denial of service, we use IP tables and some counters to maintain that. I don't suggest setting it up at this point until you kind of see how your DNS performance is and what your typical rate is before setting those values. And that might need to be something a little bit higher from an internal capacity. Now your interfaces, as we mentioned in the very first video, there's 4 interfaces defined. Those are all and should be enabled. And within the Appadmin interface, through the appliance itself, there are 4 configurations to enable disable. The 1 and 2 interface, GLAN 1 and 2, are enabled by default. GLAN 2 uses a private IP address, and I have disabled this. And keynote to this: when you disable or enable interface, you have to reboot the system so that it can pick up that hardware change. Key to note here is that GLAN 1 is the default interface, and also it's the management interface as we defined in the appliance. If I have multiple interfaces configured, I can define the management as well as the regular interfaces for services. If I click into the GLAN configuration, there are other settings that influence whether it's enabled, disabled. It's mask, MTU if you want to set that higher internally. And then you have access controls, where we can define add, deny, or allow based on IP address or network interfacing. And then you secondly have VLAN information to set up VLAN trunking so that you can trunk this interface into a VLAN on a switch and then address only clients within that VLAN, and also setting up the VLAN, the VXLAN here as well. I won't go through those settings. I don't have a switch to do that. So we'll go ahead and go back to the network. That's your interface. There's also static routes. So if you needed to go in and define any type of static routing for your lab definition, you could do this item here, add, delete, and you can also display that routing table to see the information about the routes, which I have just the default on interface 1. Any casting we do support. I won't go through that on this video, but at some point we'll cover any cast. Does require OSPF or BGP, and within that configuration, it inserts itself into the route based on the DNS availability. And IP address policy table, I won't go through this either, but it's allowing access controls based on labels so that you can set up if a IP address comes in on this particular label that looks like a network, v4, v6, or this size, you can predicate whether it's accessible or not. So that's the network menu. Date and time is going to give you access to setting up your NTP servers and effectively who is going to have access to that setting. Now, the Sapphire appliances can be configured as both NTP clients. They can have their own self-determined date and time with their own internal clock. For virtual, however, you want to definitely point to an NTP server. Otherwise, based on the host utilization, the clock slows down according to its resource. But you do want to set up NTP, and this can also be a NTP server. So we can define this in any type of stratum. You can set it up as a stratum 2, pointing it externally, make it an NTP server to your other appliances. And that's also a good way to ensure that everybody syncs together if you have an internal clock that everybody syncs with. So this is something available. There's basically an expert mode for NTP that can be defined to give you full access to everything of the NTP, or just use the basic screen settings that you have for the servers and access controls. And then from the stats, once you have NTP defined, it'll give you basically the NTPD statistics and its connectivity, reachability, and drift offset, which here we're looking pretty good with our internal server. All right. So aside from NTP and going through the time servers, you're basically going to have then IP control. And IP control is going to effectively give you the IP address of the executive, and it's going to allow us to start and stop the services or determine what starts and stops as we work through the configuration. The executive IP is the primary. If you're setting up a high available executive or DR executive, that would be a replicated server. This appliance would then check between the two executives and would connect to only the one that had the active services operational and was in the primary mode. We'll go through that replication setup in a separate video as well. And then a couple things you'll see here. Once we define DHCP and you have the pools configured and you're leasing out addresses, there is a pool utilization configuration to alert on various alert levels. So we can say that a warning is 80%, a critical is 90%, send email, send SNMP traps, or event alerts, which allow you to update your events. Now, that's a very good tool to have. It gives you some more information about the pool statistics in more real-time fashion when looking at this data. And lastly, the Sapphire Appliance is capable of being integrated to a DNS environment that's run on Microsoft Active Directory integrated DNS and or bind. Now, in terms of dynamic DNS, we support the GSS signing of the records securely into Active Directory, which means that in order for us to do Active Directory DNS, the DHCP appliance would have to be dedicated to that purpose. We could not update the Active Directory DNS and the bind dynamic DNS using tsig on the same appliance. So keep that in mind if you're configuring this, but this then allows us to have the appliance sign the dynamic update on behalf of the client into the Active Directory DNS that then gets replicated if you're using that environment. We're going to skip through this since we're not using this, but in one video I do have that setting and we'll activate it and go through that. Okay, so that's the IP control. Your logging, now this is where we will have some settings that you might want, gives you the ability to set up your remote loggers. We use an syslog, which is a high performance logger, and we've seen it actually overrun some of the logging channels. So be very careful if you have a very busy DNS server. This may not be the best approach. There are other options to doing logging, then we can discuss that. But in this case, we can set up basically the levels, the maximum size of what we're going to manage for the syslog, securely removing old logs and erasing those, clearing the bits. But then your remote logger, you would then set up your IP address, the facility levels, which will do everything, and its transport. So if you need to change ports, use UDP, I believe, but use your host name and your configurations. So the logging channel then would give us the ability to forward those, and you do have, like with the NTP and other modes, an expert mode. So if I wanted to go in and configure this syslog manually, I could go in and it gives me basically a Vim view that I can then walk through and look at the syslog. And from here, you can do any kind of standard syslog syntax. So if you want to remove certain logging or filter that out, you can do that through this setting. Okay. And the other settings that we're going to get to, I won't go through high availability because that's going to be more of a twin mirror. But in this particular case, it's also VRRP, kind of has its own video, its own discussion. But SNMP, we'll go through this quickly. We do want to have SNMP enabled. So the first thing we want to do is, we set up their state and location, and then I can say again, ATLVL. We'll use my name. My system name is VMNS1. Do DNS1. And this is a VM Sapphire X10. Okay. And every time you go back the menu, the SNMP needs to restart. You can hit Y. It does this pretty quickly. Or just go back and say no. And each time you make changes, when you're done, you can change it then. I'm going to change this protocol version back to 2C in terms of what the appliance is running. And the authentication, the Sapphire 2 is the appliance MIB that I'm going to use. We'll go ahead and just restart that again and make sure it catches it. The active MIBs, you can enable, disable the different MIBs. I want all of these enabled except for V6. I'm going to leave that off for now. So just hitting the number will toggle that. Of course, we go back, it's going to restart. And one more setting would be the traps. So if I have a SolarWinds station or some type of trap receiver, I can then set up what that trap information will look like. I do have one. I want to go ahead and set one up now just to use it, and then we can kind of show what those look like then. And I'll start that one more time. I'll send a test trap. I don't know if I'm going to get that because I don't know that I'm listening. Sure it is. So the test trap is there. So I know that when we get into that video, we'll have some to look at. All right. So that was basically the configurations, which you'll mostly be into. The SSHD, though, in terms of PuTTY, you can control that timeout from this configuration menu. And then from the system, you can also set up a login message. We do have a service monitor that's enabled by default, and it's monitoring each of the services that are enabled on the system, starts and stops those. And also having the ability to save the configuration of everything in the admin menu that we've just created. So it's going to create a config file, and that config file can then be restored if you need to pull in those settings at a later time. Okay, and from here as well, you have an automatic update capability in this appliance. What this effectively does and tells the appliance at a scheduled interval, ping the IP control executive and look for any system updates that have been marked for this appliance. And we'll get to that in a later video when we go through IP control. All right, so that's the basic configuration under the system. And then for management, you're going to have IP control, which is where you'll stop and start the services. And some of these require that you're in the menu to do this. If you start IP control, stop IP control, it includes everything. You can stop the agent, the message queue only, and leave DNS running, or you can stop DNS DHCP selectively. The system allows you to set up the system control where you can reboot the appliance. This is also where if we needed to do a local update of the appliance for its version of any OS or software, we can go to the update menu and we can either tell it to check the executive for an update or a local directory where we might have a patch file. And we'll go through those steps in a different video. You can also add, and I recommend, the operator account through the VM through this menu. The operator allows you to then run sudo commands that you can then do TCP dump and more privileged access in your systems. Other things that you'll see here too under management, like setting the date and time with the NTP to refresh that, a whole menu of diagnostic capabilities for each of the individual or some services, and then some stats and top, watching some of the log files. And services will give you the ability to manage the other non-IP control services, like SNMP, NTP, if you're running IPsec and denial of service. All right. So outside of those menu items, the rest of these will be more advanced. We'll get to those in a later video. And two other options here in the menu, like system status, gives you kind of a quick drop of all of the menu services, PIDs, users, memory. And then the information will give you all of the details about the appliance, what versions of software, hardware, virtual, and IP control builds, which we're going to have to come back and upgrade in a video to get it to the latest. All right, there you go. So that's the last video I'm going to have on this particular Sapphire series, and we're going to move on with again, the configuration of IP control. And we'll see you in the next video. Take care.